In this short video we'll look at some techniques for shooting and editing panoramas. Let's start by looking at what a panorama actually is. Well, unfortunately there's no standard definition as to what a panorama actually is. However, it's normally accepted that a panorama is an image which is at least twice as wide as it is high. Images with a ratio of 2:1, 5:2, or if you like 2.5:1, 3:1 and 4:1 are the most widely used aspect ratios for panoramas. A classic print size for panoramas is 48 by 10 centimeters or 20 by 8 inches, which uses the 5:2 ratio. Note that the 16:9 ratio used by many display screens doesn't normally meet the criteria for being a panorama. It's not quite 2:1. Note that you can also have vertoramas. A vertorama is essentially a vertical panorama. You can create one of these simply by reversing the ratios and shooting up and down rather than across. Other than that, the techniques are the same as for a normal panorama. Talking of aspect ratios, this is how they line up. The standard 35mm format used by most cameras is 3:2. A panorama comes in, as we've mentioned, anything above 2:1, with the 5:2 panorama being a typical print size used for panoramas. At 3:1 you have super panoramas, at 4:1 ultra panoramas, and anything more than 4:1 is generally termed an extreme panorama. One thing that you've got to bear in mind with aspect ratios is the different aspect ratio of the paper and of the panorama. If you're going to print on A4, or for that matter any A-size paper, the panorama is going to leave borders top and bottom, because the aspect ratios of the panorama and the paper are different. The aspect ratio of A-size paper is 1 to the square root of 2, or approximately 1.4:1. The result of which is a border top and bottom, as we see here in this little example. Many printers offer some standard sizes of panorama, as we've already mentioned, 48 by 10 centimeters or 20 by 8 inches being a typical offering. Some printers, such as DSCL, will print custom sized panoramas to virtually any ratio. Of course, any blank areas on a print can always be trimmed off or hidden behind a suitably sized mount and or framed. So you can take your picture with images top and bottom and put a mount around it which hides the borders, and then optionally frame that as well to get a nice panoramic print. So what's the simplest way to take a panorama? Well, the simplest, if not the most efficient way to take a panorama is simply to take a wideish image in landscape format. So you take your picture and include everything that you want to include in a single image in your normal 3:2 ratio. Then you can take your image and simply crop the top and bottom to a panorama ratio, getting rid of the areas that I've outlined here in red in order to produce your image. So that's the simplest way. However, depending on how you crop the image, you could be throwing away 2/3 or more of the actual pixels that you managed to capture. So let's say, for the sake of your argument, your camera has a 30 megapixel sensor. You can be left with a 10 megapixel or so image once you've cropped it. Not necessarily the end of the world, but you are losing 2/3 of your resolution effectively. Let's have a look at how you actually do that though in Photoshop before we go any further. Okay, so I'm going to load Lightroom, and here's some images that I took a little earlier, and here we have an image of Portrait in Lightroom. Now you could crop it in Lightroom itself, but I prefer to do things like this in Photoshop, so I'm simply going to right click on my image here and choose Edit in Photoshop, and that will bring up Photoshop with my image buried in it, and all I need to do now is to crop that image. So I'm going to choose my cropping tool, and having chosen my cropping tool, I need to specify how I want to crop it. So in order to crop it to the dimensions I want, I'm going to go up here, and currently I've got width times height times resolution in there. I don't want that. I'm going to click on that little drop box and choose ratio, and let's go for the standard print size ratio, as I like to call it, the 5:2 ratio. So I'll say that I want it 5:2. That automatically sizes that panorama to the ratio that I've specified, and I can then simply move this around. My horizon is very level there, so I'll just tilt that a little bit so I get my horizon reasonably level, and I'm happy with that more or less as it is. So once I've done that, I can simply press enter or click a little tick and confirm that, and there I have my image. So I'll just save that panorama now. Just do File, Save, and it was a raw file to begin with. It's now saving it as a PSD file. So if I go back to Lightroom now, just get rid of Photoshop, you can see that it's added that to Lightroom. I've got this image here ending in PSD. Next to it is the original that I started with. So I started with an image that was 60, just over 60 megapixels. I'm left with an image which is actually just over 32 or nearly 33 megapixels. So I've still got quite a bit of resolution there, but we can do better, as we'll see later on. So what's the alternative? Well, one alternative is to take two or more images in landscape and merge them together. So I can take one image like that, and you can see there I've got part of St Michael's Mount. I've included a little bit of the tree here and the castle here and the houses here down on the quay, and then move the camera around a little bit and take another image, and again I've got the castle up here, I've got the houses down here on the quay, so there's enough overlap there. Quite happy with that. And then, having taken those two images, I can simply merge them together and then, just as before, crop top and bottom. However, that's not the most efficient way. Assuming both images were around the 30 megapixels to start with, after cropping and allowing for overlap, the final image is going to be somewhere around maybe 25-30 megabytes. A little bit better than we managed previously, but still not really ideal. Let's just have a look though at how we would do that in practice. So let's go back to Photoshop. Actually, I'll go back to Lightroom first of all, and I just happen to have in Lightroom two images here taken of Portrait, which could be merged together as we've just demonstrated. Notice that when I took these pictures, I've put my hand in the picture in several places. That's useful for separating different sequences. It can get very confusing if you just have a load of images. It's useful to put your hand in front and behind so that you know where each image sequence starts and ends. So I've got this one here and this one here. I want to bring those into Photoshop, so I'll click on one, hold Control and click on the other to select them both, and then simply right click, edit in Photoshop. So there's one image. I'll just get rid of the cropping tool. So there's one image, there's the other. That's actually my panorama from before, so I'll just get rid of that. So we've got this image here, this image here. The secret is to merge them together in order to produce a panorama. I'll show you how this is done, but I wouldn't normally recommend that you do it this way. I need some space to add the other image to the end of this one. So I'm going to take this image and I'm going to resize its canvas. So I'm going to go onto Image and go onto Canvas Size and specify the canvas on which this image actually sits. So currently you can see it's got a width of about 9,500 pixels. I could need up to double that, so I'll just put there ×2. The other image, it may vary a little bit height wise. My camera might have moved on the vertical a little bit, so I need to add some height to it as well. I don't need to add that much height, so I'll just put in +500 to add 500 pixels to the height. I want to do it from the middle on the left, so it will expand it up, down and to the right. My background, currently it's going to do in this sort of browny colour, because that's what my background colour is set to. I'll have it in white so I can see what's going on. And then I'll just click OK in order to change that. And if I zoom out a bit now with Control-, you can see that I've got that image now on a canvas which is now considerably bigger than it was. So having done that, I can go to my other image here, and I need to copy that and paste it into the first image. So I'll just do Control-A to select the whole image, Control-C to copy it, go back to my first image and do Control-V to paste it onto there. And it's then simply a matter of moving this around and lining it up. Now there's all sorts of techniques you can use here. I'll just reduce the opacity of that a little bit so I can see the other image underneath. That just allows me to match it up a little bit easier. I won't spend too long doing this because you wouldn't do this normally anyway. So having got that correct, I'll push my opacity back up. So let's say I'm happy with that as it is. I can just accept that, and that's what my image is going to look like. Obviously it needs to be cropped, so I need to take the two layers here really and combine them into one. So I'll just do that with Control-E, Shift Control-E. That merges the layers together. I can then take my cropping tool. I can make sure it says ratio 5:2. I can bring in the cropping tool. And you can see here that I can actually extend it beyond the image. I need to level my horizon again. So there's a little bit of white here, which I'm not going to worry too much about. Once I'm happy with that, I can accept that, and there's my image. These white bits here I could fill in using the content aware fill or the generative fill. I'm just going to leave them for the minute. There's actually a little bit in this corner here that's missing as well. But there's my image. So if I just save that now, not perfect, but had I taken a little bit more time over it, I could have got it a lot better than that. Let's go back to Lightroom, and there's my image, and you can see that image made by taking two images and merging them together is now 95.6 megapixels. So we can get a much more detailed image doing it that way, but it's still perhaps not the best way of doing things. There is a preferred option which I'll look at now. With this option you can take multiple images in a portrait orientation. Now that sounds a bit counterintuitive really, but it does lead to a higher resolution image. What you can do in this case is you take your images in portrait orientation, and then just as before, as we did with the previous example, you overlap each one slightly. So there's my first image, I've got the tree there, and then my next image, still got the tree in it, but it's moved a little bit further to the right. Next image, got the castle in there, and then the final image in this sequence to complete it. It looks like that. So there's an identifying object, if you like, in each frame. There's an overlap of, well, somewhere around about the fifth. So I end up with something that looks like that. We can then merge them together in much the same way as I did in the previous example. If you're going to do this, you need to try and keep the camera as level as possible. Try to turn your body between shots and not the camera, and try and keep the camera in the same position, and just rotate it around its own axis. That way you'll end up with a much better image. If you're using a zoom lens, it's important you don't change the zoom between shots, otherwise it'd be extremely difficult to match up. As far as exposure is concerned, I normally just leave it as auto exposure. That will generally work fine, and we can get Photoshop to balance out the exposure later on, so it's not really a big deal if some frames are a little bit more exposed or underexposed or overexposed than others. It also doesn't matter if you have the images going from left to right or from right to left, or for that matter in random order. Because you're taking multiple images, taking panoramas in this way is really only suitable for reasonably static shots. If you have things moving through the image at fast speeds, they can appear in multiple frames, and that can cause all sorts of confusion. There are ways of getting around that, but we'll perhaps come to that later. So having taken the images, we now need to merge them together in Photoshop or Lightroom. As we've already said, if you're taking multiple sets of images, it's useful to shoot your hand or the sky or your feet or something at the beginning and end of each set, so that you have a marker so you know where each set of images begins and ends. So, take a picture of your hand, take your shots, and then take another picture of your hand at the end. You don't have to include the pictures of your hands in the final image, obviously. So in this example I've got 4 images, so assuming each of the images is 30 megabytes or 30 megapixels as before, 4 times 30 is 120. If you allow a generous 40% for overlap and cropping, that's still 80 megabytes or 80 megapixels of resolution, much more than we had previously, even after cropping. and that is the preferred way of doing things. Let's bring up Lightroom and have a look at how we create a panorama in Lightroom. So I'll bring up Lightroom and I've got some images here. This hand marks the beginning of a sequence. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 and hand again. So I've got these 4 images here which I want to take and make a panorama of them. So I'll click on the first one, hold down Shift and click on the last one to choose all 4. And to create a panorama in Lightroom, I can simply go up to where it says Photo, come down to where it says Photo Merge and choose Panorama. Now that will bring up a little dialog box which asks me a few simple questions. I can select a projection, so spherical, cylindrical or perspective, and that alters the way the images look to a certain degree. You simply choose the one that you think looks the best. I quite like the look of the perspective one. You can tell it to fill the edges if you want. That will basically get rid of any transparent bits around the outside where the images left gaps. So that's probably a good thing to do in most cases. You can create a stack of the images, which I won't bother to do with at the minute. But once you've got all this set to your preferences, you click Merge and then sit back and let Lightroom do its thing. You can see up here it says it's creating a panorama. We're giving it quite a bit of work to do there because in this case I've got 4 60 megapixel raw images which it's got to process. It will take those pictures, it will load them up, it will equalize the exposures, and it will then work out how to merge and align them in order to create a panorama. It will then fill in any sort of blank areas using content aware fill. And it's done that now, and you can see here it's actually created the panorama. If I look at that, you can see it's produced the panorama. It didn't give me the opportunity there to level the horizon, but I could obviously crop that now and do that if I wanted to. But it shows the principle of the thing, and it's much easier obviously doing it that way than trying to take the individual images, merge them together yourself, and notice that there's an even exposure across the image, so it's dealt with that for us as well. Let's go back to the main view over here. So that's using Lightroom to create the panorama. If you use Photoshop to create the panorama instead, you get many more options. So let's have a look at creating the panorama in Photoshop. I'll just delete this image here because I don't want that. I'll start by selecting my 4 images again. And then having selected the 4 images, I'll show you a couple of ways. I'll do it this way first of all. I can simply right click on there and then choose Edit In and choose Photoshop. That will load in Photoshop. So that's loaded in Photoshop now with my 4 images up here. I'll just get rid of my cropping box. So there's one image, there's the other. So there are the 4 images. So to create a panorama in Photoshop, very similar method. I can simply go on to File and Automate and then choose Photo Merge. So having chosen File, Automate, Photo Merge, I get a slightly different looking dialog box in Photoshop, which does more or less the same thing. Again, I've got different layout styles here, including the perspective, the cylindrical and the spherical that we had in Lightroom, plus a couple of others. Generally, I find that in Photoshop, auto works quite well. I can then choose the files which I want to include in the panorama, and what I can do here is simply tell it to add the open files. And then there are some other options down here. Blend the images together. Well, yes, I want to do that. That's the whole point of doing it. I want to remove any vignettes, correct any geometric distortions, and again I'll have it fill the transparent areas so I don't have any transparent or white gaps around the outside. So that's me set. So a few more options here in Photoshop that you don't have in Lightroom. But again, having done that, I just press OK and Photoshop goes off and it does its thing. Another advantage of doing it in Photoshop is you can actually see what's going on. You can see that it's taken all of those images and it's created a layer with each of those images on it. It's now aligning the layers, working out how they overlap and which bits overlap with which other bits, and it's lining the layers up. And you'll see what it does shortly. Having worked out how they align and such like, it will then build a mask to mask different parts of the layers to decide which bits of each image it's going to use, and it will then use that to create my panorama. So Photoshop is now merging those images together, creating a seamless panorama by taking those images, aligning them, evening up the exposures, and then working out how best to overlap the images to produce the best panorama. So it's now created my panorama. Notice that we have some marching ants around the edges of the image. These mark the areas where Photoshop didn't have any pixels, and it simply filmed the pixels using content aware fill so that I didn't have transparent or white areas around the outside. I can get rid of those by just pressing Ctrl D. That gets rid of the marching ants. Ctrl D basically just deletes a selection. I don't particularly want these composite layers either anymore. The original images, I don't want these included, so I'll simply just highlight those and then delete those layers and get rid of those. Just helps keep the file size a bit more manageable. So there's my image. As you can see, it's not quite as I'd like it because it's not in the right panorama ratio that I want, and also the horizon isn't level. So I'm just going to choose my cropping tool, make sure my ratio is set to 5:2, which is the ratio that I prefer to use for panoramas, and then I'm going to just tilt that a little bit to level my horizon up. Once I'm happy with that, I can just press enter or press the little tick to confirm that, and it will go off and crop my image. So there we have the panorama. So all that I need to do now is to save that image. So I just click on File, Save, and it will then save that image. And then once the image has saved, I can close it. I don't really want to keep these other images, so I just do File, close them, and not bother to make any changes to them. So if I now go back to Lightroom, there's my panorama which I've just created, and you can see there it's actually 143 megapixels in size, which means it's got a fair bit of resolution to it. Having that much resolution obviously means that there is an awful lot of detail in there, which means you can zoom in onto various elements. Let's have a look. I'll open it in Photoshop again, just so it's easier to zoom in and see what's going on. So there's the image or the panorama brought back into Photoshop, and I'm currently looking at it. I'm looking at the image viewed at 4%. So if I do Control 1, I'm now looking at it at 100%, and you can see how much detail there is there in the image. It's captured all of that detail. That simply wouldn't be possible if you'd taken a single image and cropped it top and bottom. Look at the detail there. You can actually see inside the house. You see some of the pictures on the walls inside the house. So you can get some really fine detail. If I just zoom back out so you can see how far we've actually zoomed in, that's what we're actually looking at. So you can see you can actually create a panorama and include within there an awful lot of detail should you want to. It's worth noting that when you create panoramas, some distortions can occur. A lot of these distortions you can actually control or eliminate by choosing the appropriate layout. As I've mentioned, auto generally does a good job, and you've also got the geometric distortion correction there, which also can help. That said, it doesn't always cure everything. Some distortions can occur when you're creating panoramas which there's not a lot you can do about. Take this image here with these people sat on the wall. If you take a panorama by holding the camera and rotating it as we recommended earlier, then distortions which are further away from the camera are generally not going to be visible. But if there's something close to the camera, distortions can occur. In the example here, because the camera isn't rotating perfectly around its optical axis, then things that are close to the camera appear to be curved. That wall which people are sat on appears to be curved. It's not actually curved at all, it's perfectly straight. If you want to avoid distortions when creating panoramas, there are a few tricks you can use. First of all, distortions, such as the one shown on the last image, are very difficult to correct after shooting. There's some things you can do, and maybe have a look at some of those, but be aware that distortions can and will occur, but you can always use that creatively. If you want to avoid distortions, then try to avoid things close to the camera and maybe use a longer lens. Distortion can be your friend, it can be creative. If you really want to avoid distortion, you'll need to invest in a tripod and a panoramic mount or L bracket, which can hold the camera or lens in such a way that it can rotate more accurately around its optical centre. That will also not only reduce distortions, but also reduce the sort of white or transparent areas that need to be filled in when you crop your image. Another thing that you need to be aware of is file size. When you shoot panoramas, you're likely to end up with images that consists of composites from other images on a number of different layers. And in addition to that, you might have adjustment layers, effects, masks, and so on top of that. So files can very quickly become very, very large. If you're saving things as a Photoshop PSD file, the maximum size of a PSD file is 2 GB, with a maximum dimension of 30,000 pixels, either in height or in width. If your image is bigger than that, you can't save it as a PSD file, and you'll be advised to save it as a PSB file instead. PSB files can be huge, just as you won't believe how vastly, hugely, mind-bogglingly big they can be. I mean, you might think it's a long way down the road to the chemist, but that's just peanuts to a PSB file. Apologies to Douglas Adams for that quote from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If we're talking about PSB files, the actual theoretical maximum size is 4 exabytes. That's 4.2 billion gigabytes, with a maximum dimension of 300,000 pixels in either height or width. So to put it in perspective, that's over 30 meters at 300 pixels per inch. That is big. Obviously you can reduce the file size. You can do that by deleting layers that you no longer need, or by downsampling the image. Let's have a look at creating a file, looking at a few distortions and saving it as a PSB file. I'm going to create a panorama and look at some of the problems with file size and distortion, etc. I have here some images of Port Reith, starting with this hand here. So that image there is the first one, and going through to that hand marks the last one. So I'll press Shift and select that one. So I'll select all of those images, 12 images in total, and I'm going to create a panorama from these. I'm going to do it slightly differently this time. I'm going to right click and choose Edit In, but this time instead of choosing Edit in Photoshop, I'm going to choose Edit In and go down to where it says Merge to Panorama in Photoshop. Now if I do that, it loads in Photoshop, and it then automatically brings up the Photo Merge dialog box with all of my files already in there, so I don't have to go and enter, add them manually or load them into Photoshop first. I can specify the layout. I'm going to leave it as auto, and I'm going to tick these boxes here so that it automatically blends them together, removes the vignette, corrects some distortion, and fills in all the blank areas. So having done that, I'm just going to press OK and let Photoshop get on with it. Now it's going to take quite a while to do this because we have got 12 images. Each image is a raw file of 60 odd megapixels. It's got to take each image, it's got to load it into Photoshop, it's got to analyze it, it's got to work out where the overlaps are with the other images, it's got to equalize the exposures, it's then got to blend them together, it's then going to have to make merging seamlessly, it's going to have to create the masks, and then finally produce the correct image. So it may take a little while for it to do this. How long Photoshop takes to create the panorama is going to vary depending on a number of factors. For example, what format your original images are in, whether they are RAW files or JPEGs or PSD files, what their sizes are, and of course what the capabilities of your computer are. In this particular case we're talking 12 60 megapixel images. That's 720 megapixels in order to be processed, so it will take a little time for it to do this. So Photoshop has now done its thing, and you can see that's the image that I've ended up with. Notice how the railings curve where they're actually in reality straight, but apart from that the distortion is reasonably well handled. Let's then have a look at saving this image. In order to save it, I'm simply going to, I'll get rid of the marching ants before I do anything, and then I'm simply going to save it. So I'll just do File, Save, and it starts to save the image. And eventually a message pops up saying it can't save the document because it exceeds the 2 GB limit for this file type. Would I like to save it in large file format, PSB? So at that point I'll need to choose OK. It offers to call it something, and I'll just hit save at that point to save it as a PSB file. And the save process then begins again, and this time hopefully it will save it. Notice that it now says writing large document format. So once it's saved that, I can obviously close it, and I'll go back to Lightroom. And once Lightroom updates itself, you'll see the image appear here in Lightroom. Okay, let's move on. And all the Vertorama is really is a vertical panorama. So the principles are essentially the same as for panoramas, but they are notoriously more tricky. When you take multiple images of a subject that's vertical, it's impossible to rotate the camera on its optical axis, or at least it is unless you use tilt and shift lenses and other fancy stuff. Also, you've got the problem that you're typically a lot closer to the subject than you would be for a normal panorama, especially the bottom of the subject. The bottom of the subject is generally on the ground where you are, and the top of the subject is a long way off. It's important, therefore, that you allow space around the subject so that you can at least try to correct the distortions afterwards. So the principle is the same. You take your images in landscape orientation. So there we have image 1. You overlap and take another image. You overlap and take another image, and so on to complete the whole panorama. You then create and edit the Vertoramas in exactly the same way. You use the photo merge option and choose the option to merge into a panorama. You select your files. The geometric distortion option may help, but to be honest, what it can do is fairly limited. You can minimize the distortions by using a longer lens, as we mentioned, and moving further from the subject, although that's not always possible with Vertoramas. Try to get square onto the subject. If you shoot across the subject at a strange angle, it makes it much more difficult and prone to distortion. Choose a higher viewpoint if you can, so you're shooting nearer to the middle of the subject. Again, not almost practical. So typically you could end up with a Vertorama that looks like this example. But all is not lost, because you can take the image into Photoshop and do your correct. Okay, so I'm going to go back into Lightroom, and somewhere down here I've got some pictures to create a Vertorama. Right, these will do. The hand marks the beginning, so I've got 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to take those images, I'm going to right click on there, edit in, and I'm going to go down to merge to panorama in Photoshop. I'm going to bring my images in. I'm going to just use the auto layout for the moment, and I'm going to tick my boxes, choose OK, and Photoshop will go off and do its thing, merging these images together to create my Vertorama. So it's aligning the layers. There's only 3 images in this, so it shouldn't take too long to actually process those images. Nearly done. So as you can see, it's created my panorama. I'm just going to get rid of the marching ants, Control D to get rid of the marching ants, and you can see it's quite badly distorted. So I'll show you the basis of making some correction to that. The easiest way, so I'll choose my top layer here, and what I want to do is to then choose filter, camera raw filter, choose a little geometry tool, and choose this option here to manually draw some lines. And then I can choose lines which are either horizontal or vertical. So this line across the top here, that should be horizontal. So should this line here along the tops of the arches. I should have a line going down the center, which is vertical, and also the line of the tower should be vertical. So I've now produced something that looks like that. Now, apart from not being correct, it actually goes off the top of the image, so I'll need to use the scale option to bring it back, and I can move it down as well by using the offset. So I'm using the scale and offset buttons just to bring it back into an area where I can edit it. And then I can play around with these lines, so maybe move them. What I might find is that having got that far, it's probably better to choose OK, and then to let Photoshop make the corrections, and then go back into it again and readjust it again. So again, click on the little geometry tool, and then again this line here should be vertical, this line here should be vertical, this line here should be horizontal. I'm still getting the curve at the bottom here. But you can see the principle of the idea. As I say, you may have to do this several times geometry tool, manual adjustment. You can go in and alter the sort of pitch of the building as well if you want, or if you've taken it with slightly askew, you can make corrections in that way. And it's just a matter of persevering, drawing in your guides, and trying to get the whole thing to look better. That window should be circular, so I'm just going to alter the aspect ratio just to bring that in, make it more circular. So you get the idea anyway. So you basically produce your image like that. Then once you're happy with that, then you can simply use your cropping tool and crop it. If I use 5:2 again, I don't want it obviously in that direction. I need to turn it round. 5:2 isn't going to fit in this case, but what I'll do is I'll simply go for X and Y resolution. That'll basically let me specify where I want to make the crop. And once I'm happy with it, I can OK. Okay, not perfect, but you get the general idea.